Here I am, putting my story out there because, honestly, I don't know how else to process this. My wife, Stephanie, and I had been married for 8 years. She was my best friend, the woman I'd shared everything with, and for a long time I thought we were rock solid. I'd even dreamed of starting a family with her. Kids, the whole package. But looking back, maybe I'd been ignoring signs, things that should have raised red flags. Stephanie and I had this close circle, and my best friend, Dave, was part of it. He'd been with me through everything: high school, breakups, college, jobs. When I introduced him to Stephanie, they hit it off like a house on fire, which I thought was great at the time. I mean, who doesn't want their wife and best friend to get along? But then, slowly, I noticed how close they'd gotten. At first, I brushed it off, thinking I was just being paranoid. But little things started adding up. Stephanie would stay out late, saying she was hanging out with her friends or working late, and Dave would somehow be unavailable on those same nights. I never wanted to believe it was more than coincidence. I trusted them both. I mean, this was my wife and my best friend, right? Looking back, I realized I was blind, maybe even willfully blind. It started with small things, stuff you could easily brush off if you weren't looking for it. Stephanie and Dave would share these little jokes that I wasn't in on, or I'd catch them exchanging a quick glance across the room. Harmless, right? That's what I kept telling myself. I didn't want to be the jealous husband. I wanted to be the guy who trusted his wife and his best friend without question. So I kept quiet, even when something gnawed at the back of my mind. Then came the work events and girls' nights. Stephanie was always heading out, dressing up a little more than usual, with this air of excitement that just didn't feel right. Sometimes she'd come home late, smelling like a mix of perfume and cologne that wasn't hers. I'd ask her how the night went, but she'd brush it off, distracted, saying she was tired and needed to get to bed. I tried telling myself that everyone needed space and that I shouldn't be clingy. But deep down, I knew something was off. It wasn't just Stephanie either. Dave's behavior changed too. He'd avoid eye contact or he'd get overly chatty, like he was overcompensating. We'd always grab beers and catch up, but now he'd have some excuse ready to dodge our regular hangouts. He'd laugh a little too hard at things Stephanie said, or he'd be the first to answer her texts during group chats. Again, I ignored it. I didn't want to believe that two people I loved and trusted could betray me like that. One evening, after Stephanie told me she was going out with her friends, I decided to call up one of those friends, Sarah, on a hunch. We were friendly enough so it didn't feel out of line. When I casually asked her about their plans, Sarah hesitated, then said she hadn't seen Stephanie in weeks. The pit in my stomach got heavier, but I didn't react. I thanked her, hung up, and sat there, staring at the wall, trying to process what I just heard. Everything inside me wanted to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't just caught Stephanie in a lie. But my instincts told me that I couldn't ignore it any longer. That night, after hearing from Sarah, I couldn't sleep. My mind was a storm of memories and doubts, piecing together every suspicious moment with Stephanie and Dave. The laughter, the shared glances, the subtle shifts in their tone when they spoke about each other. All the things I'd ignored or written off as harmless. I felt foolish, like I'd been the butt of some twisted inside joke they were in on, and I was the clueless bystander. I needed proof, something tangible that would force me to confront the truth I was already starting to believe. So, the next day, I decided to leave work early and check up on Stephanie. It was her work-from-home day, and I figured if nothing else, maybe I'd surprise her with lunch. But deep down, I knew that wasn't my real reason. I pulled up to the house, parked a few doors down, and sat in the car, half hoping I'd see her through the window, working at her desk like she'd claimed. But there was nothing. The house was quiet, lifeless. My heart pounded as I walked up to the front door, reaching for my keys. But just as I was about to unlock it, I heard muffled voices inside. I froze, my hand still on the key, listening. It was unmistakably Stephanie's voice, low and laughing, followed by a familiar chuckle. Dave's. I felt my entire body go numb. They were in there, together, in our home. I leaned closer, trying to make out the words, but it was enough to hear their laughter, to know that the betrayal I'd feared was real. In a daze, I backed away from the door and stumbled back to my car, unable to believe what was happening. I sat there, barely breathing, just watching the house. Minutes felt like hours. The image of them together, laughing, sharing secrets in the home I'd built with Stephanie, stuck in my mind like a sickening reel on repeat. It was humiliating, enraging, and heartbreaking all at once. But I wasn't going to sit there and wallow. I decided that if they were going to sneak around behind my back, I'd catch them in the act. So I waited, and sure enough, about an hour later, I saw the door open and watched as Dave stepped out, grinning like he hadn't just violated every bond of friendship and loyalty we'd ever had. Stephanie was there too, leaning in the doorway, laughing as she waved him off. It took every ounce of restraint I had not to charge up to them right then and there. But I knew I needed a plan. After Dave drove off, I walked back up to the house, forcing myself to stay calm. I stepped inside, and Stephanie looked surprised, but she quickly masked it with that too-sweet smile she always used to deflect. "Oh, you're home early," she said, a bit too cheerfully. "I was just finishing up some work stuff." I nodded, barely able to look at her without my stomach twisting. "Yeah, thought I'd surprise you with lunch." She glanced away, her face falling slightly, as if the idea of spending a spontaneous afternoon with her husband wasn't exactly what she wanted. I could feel the anger boiling inside me, but I swallowed it down. I needed to see how far she was willing to lie, even when I practically had her dead to rights. And that's when I noticed it, the envelope. I kept my gaze steady on Stephanie, even though my blood was boiling beneath the surface. She tried to brush past me to get back to her work, but I wasn't ready to let her off the hook that easily. I moved further into the room, pretending to be casual, and that's when my eyes fell on it. The small, unassuming envelope resting on her desk. It seemed out of place among her things, a little too personal, almost like she wanted it tucked away, hidden. I casually walked over to her desk, picking up a paper nearby, all while keeping an eye on her reaction. Her whole body tensed when she noticed my gaze shift toward the envelope, a flash of nervousness breaking through her calm facade. And that was all the confirmation I needed. Whatever was in that envelope, she did not want me to see it. "What's this?" I asked, keeping my tone light, as if I was genuinely curious. I reached for the envelope, but her hand shot out to grab it before I could. "Oh, it's just some work stuff." She forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow, unconvincing. I looked her dead in the eyes, and I saw the mask slip for a fraction of a second. Panic flickered across her face, only for an instant, but it was enough to fuel the storm already brewing inside me. "You mind if I take a look?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, daring her to lie again. She hesitated, her hand tightening around the envelope, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to come up with an excuse. But the words wouldn't come out. She just stood there, frozen, caught between trying to protect her secret and the realization that I wasn't buying a word of it. "Actually, I don't think you need to see it," she finally said, a nervous edge to her voice. "It's not important." "Not important?" I echoed, letting a touch of sarcasm slip through. "If it's not important, then why are you so determined to keep it from me?" Her eyes darted around, and I could tell she was scrambling. The cool, collected woman I'd married was suddenly on the defensive, her walls crumbling faster than she could rebuild them. I decided to push harder, leaning forward with a look that I knew would make her uncomfortable. "Hand it over, Stephanie," I demanded, my tone leaving no room for debate. "Let's see this work stuff." She stood there for a second, her face a mixture of anger and desperation. But she knew I wouldn't let it go. With a resigned sigh, she dropped her hand from the envelope, letting me take it. I didn't waste a second. I ripped it open, bracing myself for whatever sick reality lay inside. And the contents? They were worse than I'd imagined. Inside was a letter, another one of those personal, gut-wrenching notes, but this one was from Stephanie to him. She hadn't even tried to hide it well. The handwriting, her little heart-shaped doodles in the margins. It was so obvious. But the words were a dagger to the heart. She wrote about how much she missed him, how she couldn't stand hiding it anymore, and how she wished she'd never settled for our life together. She even mentioned their plans to figure things out in a few months, after she sorted things out on her end. Every line felt like a punch to the gut. But the worst part? The note ended with her saying that she'd leave a key under the mat, just in case he wanted to drop by while I was out. It was blatant, and the sheer disrespect in her words and tone was nauseating. She was openly planning to bring my best friend into our home while I was at work, and she was treating it like some kind of romantic game. I looked up, and for a moment, I saw fear in her eyes. She knew I'd found it. She knew there was no turning back, no talking her way out of it. But instead of remorse or guilt, she went cold, her expression hardening as she folded her arms and stared at me like I was the one who'd crossed a line. "Are you happy now?" she snapped, venom dripping from her words. "Now you've got your answer. So what are you going to do about it?" Her defiance, her utter lack of remorse, pushed me over the edge. She wasn't even sorry. She wasn't scared of losing me or ashamed of what she'd done. No, Stephanie looked at me like I was nothing more than an inconvenience, a hurdle she had to get past to get to Dave. It was like a switch flipped inside me. The rage that I'd been holding back, the hurt, the humiliation, it all surged forward, filling me with a kind of clarity I hadn't felt before. "I'll tell you exactly what I'm going to do," I said, my voice low, steady. "I'm going to make sure both of you regret ever thinking you could do this to me." And in that moment, I knew I wasn't just going to confront them. No, that was too easy. I was going to make sure they felt the sting of their betrayal as deeply as I had. And I had a plan forming in my mind, a way to make them understand that they'd crossed the wrong person. After that confrontation, something in me just snapped. It was like a cold, calculated focus replaced the heartbreak, pushing all the emotions down so I could think clearly. Stephanie and Dave had been lying to me, toying with my life as if it was nothing. And the fact that she didn't even try to apologize, didn't even pretend to be sorry, that fueled the fire that was building inside me. I didn't want just a simple confrontation. I wanted them to feel the humiliation, the betrayal, the gut-wrenching agony they'd put me through. I started planning. I knew Stephanie was still under the impression that I'd just slink away, lick my wounds, and let her and Dave carry on. But I wanted to be sure they'd never forget the mistake they made in crossing me. I decided to play the long game, letting her think she'd won, giving her a false sense of security. I'd let her think I was too weak to fight back, that I'd given up. The best revenge, I realized, would be to turn their lives upside down when they least expected it. The first step was making sure Stephanie thought I was out of the house for the entire day. I told her I'd be gone on a business trip and wouldn't be back until late. I even packed a small bag and left the house early in the morning, making a big show of it. Little did she know, I hadn't actually gone anywhere. I stayed close, waiting, watching, fully expecting her to invite him over. Hours passed, and I was nearly losing patience when I finally saw it. Dave's car pulling up to the house. My stomach clenched, and anger flared, but I kept myself steady. I watched as he walked up to the front door, confidently letting himself in with the key she'd left under the mat. It was like they had no shame, no respect. My best friend, slipping into my home like it was his, completely comfortable betraying me under my own roof. I waited, letting the seconds tick by, until I was certain they were inside, probably basking in the thrill of their secret little affair. I pulled out my phone, taking a deep breath, and called a few of our mutual friends. I'd invited them over under the guise of an urgent gathering. I told them Stephanie was planning a surprise for Dave, who they all knew was my closest friend. I didn't give too many details, just enough to make it sound intriguing. I knew they'd be curious enough to show up, especially since I kept the whole thing mysterious. As I watched the clock, each minute felt like an eternity, but I knew the payoff would be worth it. About 30 minutes later, the first of our friends arrived, looking a bit confused but excited. I greeted them casually, chatting and smiling, all while keeping my anger simmering below the surface. Soon enough, a few more showed up, and I had a decent group gathered outside. They looked at me with curiosity, probably wondering what kind of surprise I'd planned. I gestured for them to be quiet as I led them to the front door. I had intentionally left it unlocked, knowing they wouldn't be expecting me back anytime soon. My heart was pounding as I opened the door, motioning for everyone to follow me quietly inside. I could feel the anticipation in the air, my friends oblivious to the real reason they were here, eagerly following me with curiosity. As we moved further inside, we could hear faint laughter coming from the bedroom. I held up a finger, signaling for them to stay silent, and then walked ahead, leading them toward the sound. The laughter grew louder, mixed with whispers, and that's when I knew they were caught in their own twisted world, fully comfortable and completely unaware of what was about to hit them. I opened the door, and there they were, Stephanie and Dave, tangled together, so absorbed in their little fantasy that they didn't notice us right away. But the instant they looked up and saw me standing there, surrounded by friends, their faces went pale. Stephanie scrambled, trying to cover herself, eyes wide with shock, while Dave looked like he'd seen a ghost. The silence was thick, my friends standing there, stunned, processing the scene in front of them. What's going on?" One of our friends stammered, breaking the tension. Stephanie looked at me, her face a mask of horror, but still, there was a glint of anger in her eyes, like somehow I was the one who'd crossed the line. She opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off, my voice cold and even. "Oh, I thought everyone deserved to see the surprise you and Dave had been planning behind my back," I said, barely able to keep the venom out of my tone. "After all, you both went to so much trouble to hide it. Seemed only fair to let everyone in on the secret." Stephanie stammered, her face contorted with a mix of anger and shame, while Dave stood there, frozen, too cowardly to say a word. My friends looked at me, then at them, piecing it all together. I watched their expressions shift, from confusion to disgust, as the reality of what was happening dawned on them. The betrayal, the lies, everything was exposed, laid bare in the most humiliating way possible. "You two deserve each other," I said finally, my voice steady, despite the storm raging inside me. "Enjoy your little affair, because after this, you'll have no one else left." With that, I turned and walked out, leaving Stephanie and Dave to face the wreckage they'd created, the shock and disgust of our friends lingering behind me as I made my exit. It wasn't just revenge, it was justice, a way to make sure they felt even a fraction of the humiliation they'd put me through. As I walked away, I felt an odd sense of closure, knowing that they'd have to live with the shame, exposed for who they truly were, while I moved on, free from the lies and betrayal. Walking away from that scene felt like shedding a weight I'd carried far too long. I had left Stephanie and Dave to pick up the pieces of the mess they'd made, humiliated in front of our friends, their betrayal now public knowledge. But I knew this was only the beginning. Revenge isn't always swift or clean. It lingers, echoing through every part of their lives as they face the consequences. And I wasn't quite done making sure they felt every bit of it. The fallout was immediate. Word spread quickly. The group chat was blowing up within hours, everyone talking about what had gone down, each person adding their own commentary and shock. I didn't respond, just let them talk, let them process what they'd witnessed. It was like dropping a match in a dry forest. The flames of gossip and outrage spread faster than I could have imagined. By the end of the night, nearly everyone in our social circle knew what Stephanie and Dave had done. I heard from mutual friends that Dave was practically in hiding, avoiding calls, texts, and invitations. The guy who'd once been my closest friend, my confidant, was now shunned by the very people he'd always been so proud to impress. He tried to reach out to me, of course. The messages started coming in a few hours after I left. At first, they were apologetic, desperate attempts to explain, to justify, to make himself look like the victim. "It wasn't planned, man," he wrote. "It just happened." The audacity of it made me laugh. I ignored him, knowing that no apology would be enough to erase what he'd done. Let him stew in his own mess. Stephanie, on the other hand, was a different story. She wasn't the type to hide or accept blame easily. True to form, she came at me with anger and accusations, furious that I'd exposed her so publicly. She blamed me, saying I was the one who humiliated her, that I'd gone too far by bringing everyone into it. She tried to twist it, turning herself into the victim, acting as if I'd wronged her. It was unbelievable. After everything she'd done, she still couldn't accept responsibility. Her messages were relentless. She went from furious to pleading, then back to accusing. "You ruined my reputation," she wrote in one message. "How could you embarrass me like that?" As if she hadn't ripped my heart out and stomped all over it. I realized then that any shred of respect I might have had for her was gone. She was a stranger, someone who only cared about herself, who couldn't see beyond her own needs and desires. And I was finally free from her grasp. In the days that followed, I started making arrangements to move out. The house was in both our names, but I didn't want to stay there, surrounded by memories of a life that had been a lie. I found an apartment across town, a small but cozy place that felt like a fresh start. Packing up my things was strangely therapeutic. I left Stephanie's belongings untouched, didn't take anything that wasn't mine. I wanted a clean break, a chance to start over without carrying anything of hers with me. Meanwhile, Stephanie's life was falling apart. I heard through the grapevine that she'd lost friends, people who couldn't look past the betrayal. Her reputation, the polished image she'd always presented, was now shattered, the truth laid bare for everyone to see. She tried to play it down, of course, acting like she didn't care, like she was the one in control. But I knew better. She thrived on people's admiration, and now, she was left with nothing but disdain and whispers behind her back. Dave was equally miserable. Our once shared friends were avoiding him like the plague, not wanting to be associated with someone who could so easily betray the people closest to him. He was alienated, isolated, and I knew he'd be haunted by this for a long time. The act of revenge wasn't just about the moment. It was about the lasting damage, the scar it left on their lives. Settling into my new apartment brought a strange mix of emotions. I was finally free from the web of lies Stephanie and Dave had spun around me, yet I felt an emptiness in my chest that I couldn't shake. It was like standing in a house stripped bare, with only the echoes of what once was. I had to rebuild, piece by piece, finding new routines, new habits, and a new direction for my life. For the first time in years, I focused on myself. The things I'd neglected while I was busy trying to be the perfect husband, the loyal friend, they became my priorities again. I went back to the gym, something I'd let slide while I was working long hours and dealing with Stephanie's needs. I picked up old hobbies, joined a local sports league, and even took a few weekend trips just for the thrill of it. Each day felt a little lighter, like the chains that had kept me tethered to that miserable life were finally starting to loosen. It wasn't all smooth sailing, though. There were nights when I'd lie awake, my mind replaying everything over and over, each memory stinging with betrayal. I'd think about the look on Stephanie's face when I caught her, the shameless way she tried to twist things, and Dave's pathetic excuses. But instead of getting angry, I used those thoughts as fuel, a reminder of how far I'd come and how much I'd overcome. They'd betrayed me, yes, but I had risen above it. Around this time, I started meeting new people. I wasn't ready for a serious relationship, far from it, but the company was nice. It reminded me that life was still out there, waiting for me, and that I didn't have to carry the weight of betrayal forever. I'd go out with friends, join new groups, and gradually, I found myself laughing again, feeling joy without the shadow of my past lurking over me. I also found myself rethinking what I wanted out of relationships. I'd been so focused on making Stephanie happy, on being the good husband, that I'd forgotten what I wanted for myself. It was time to reclaim that. I promised myself I'd never lose sight of who I was or sacrifice my own happiness for someone else's approval again. As for Stephanie and Dave, they faded into the background. I didn't block them, didn't go out of my way to avoid hearing about them. I wanted to see just how far they'd fall without me in their lives. And from what I heard, it wasn't pretty. Stephanie's attempt to salvage her image had flopped, and she was struggling to keep friends around. Dave had gone completely silent, a shadow of the loud, confident guy he used to be. Their relationship, if you could even call it that, was crumbling too. From what I heard, they argued constantly, blaming each other for everything. It was almost poetic, watching their little house of lies fall apart just as they'd tried to ruin mine. I didn't reach out, didn't try to interfere. They were their own punishment. Knowing they had to live with the fallout, the shame, and the knowledge of what they'd done, that was enough for me. Months passed, and with each day, I felt the weight of the betrayal lifting. My life was no longer defined by what they'd done to me, but by what I was building in their absence. I'd found a solid group of friends, reconnected with family, and started setting goals that were just for me. Each milestone felt like a triumph, a reminder that I'd taken back control of my life from the wreckage they'd left behind. Then one evening, out of the blue, I got a message from Stephanie. Seeing her name pop up on my screen brought a wave of unexpected emotions. Anger, pity, even a twisted sense of satisfaction. I debated ignoring it, but curiosity won out. The message was long, filled with apologies and rationalizations, an attempt to explain away what she'd done. She wrote about how lonely she'd felt, how confused she'd been, how she'd made a terrible mistake. It was a desperate attempt to claw back some dignity, but to me it was just empty words. The message ended with a plea to meet and talk. She wanted to explain herself, to seek forgiveness, maybe even rekindle some form of friendship. She mentioned that she was struggling, and that she missed the life we had. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. This was the same woman who had mocked my trust, who'd spat on our marriage vows without a second thought. But instead of anger, I felt nothing. The revenge, the fallout, and my own journey forward had done their job. I no longer needed closure from her, no explanations, no apologies. I'd rebuilt my life, and she was nothing more than a ghost from a past that I'd outgrown. I left her message on read, a silent reminder that she no longer had any power over me. As for Dave, he never reached out, and I preferred it that way. His silence was his own admission of guilt, a quiet acknowledgement that he'd lost everything. Our friendship, his reputation, and whatever respect he once had. He, too, had faded into obscurity, leaving only whispers of his betrayal behind. It was ironic how the two people who'd tried to destroy me had ended up destroying each other instead. And that, more than any dramatic confrontation or heated argument, was the real revenge. I had my life back, my peace, and my pride. They had nothing but each other's bitterness and regret. Time has a way of healing wounds you don't think will ever close. With Stephanie and Dave now just a painful memory, I was able to embrace my new life fully. The bitterness that had once gripped me was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of peace and self-respect. I was proud of the person I'd become, not despite what they'd done but because of it. Their betrayal had tested me, pushed me to my lowest, but it had also revealed my strength. I started to reflect on the experience, not with anger, but with a strange sort of gratitude. It wasn't about forgiving them. It was about recognizing the resilience I'd found in myself. I was stronger, wiser, and I'd learned the importance of setting boundaries, of standing up for myself, of never allowing someone to devalue me the way they had. I began to give advice to others going through similar situations, realizing that my story could help people see that betrayal doesn't define them. It was freeing to share my experience with the intent to empower rather than seek sympathy. It was a reminder to others, and to myself, that no matter how broken you feel, you can always rise from it, stronger and more determined than before. A year after it all went down, I found myself in a healthy, genuine relationship with someone who valued trust and communication. It was different, a partnership built on mutual respect and understanding, without hidden agendas or lies. I knew I'd never have found this happiness had I stayed trapped in the web Stephanie and Dave had spun. The lessons from that dark time remained with me, shaping me into a person I could respect. Stephanie and Dave were no longer anything more than a part of my story, a chapter I'd closed and left behind. I was free to live, love, and build a life that truly reflected who I was. And if I could share any advice with others, it's this: don't let someone else's betrayal rob you of your self-worth. Stand tall, be true to yourself, and know that life goes on, often in ways that are even better than you imagined.